Hi, Sadek, can you hear me?
Hello, Joe. Yes, I hear you and I see you very well.
Great, excellent.
Good to see you.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Byron, how are you?
Good.
Hi, Byron.
Hi.
So I'm looking how to, okay. Do you need to enable me at some point to share my screen?
Yes, I do, and I'm doing it as we speak.
Oh, super, thank you.
You should be good now.
All right.
Go
Let's
ahead
see.
if you want to give it a try.
Yeah, I was thinking I'd do that, yeah.
Okay, good idea. There you go.
Yeah. Okay, now I stop share, and that was pretty quick, so no problem.
Cool.
So I invited Uli. Oh, hi, Uli, you're here? And she's a doctoral student of mine who will chime in just for a few minutes here and there.
That's great.
Morning.
But it should
Good morning,
overall
Michael.
be roughly an hour.
Morning, Michael.
Hey, everyone.
You all? Hey, Seth.
Hi,
Joe.
Hi,
Seth
Seth.
and Michael.
Hey,
Hi,
Joe.
Seth.
Long
How are
time
you?
no see, Joe. Nice to
Yay.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you. Hey, Michael.
Thanks for joining us.
Can I ask you guys, anybody who's here right now, for some feedback? Did anybody receive an email saying the meeting is canceled? No. Okay, good.
No.
Okay.
So what happened was Sadek apparently made some small change in the text and reset it. And I at least got a message saying that the
Three
first that it
people
was
did.
canceled
Three
and then,
people.
so anyhow.
Yeah, three people here at Harvard got a note that says it's canceled, and we're trying to figure out how the heck that happened. Anyway,
Maybe they met last
Hello,
week.
Lou.
no.
Hmm.
So Joe, you now have our former student and good friend Hamda with you.
Yes,
Hello.
she's with us now.
Hi, Dr. Byron. Hi, Joe.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, Tracy, hi.
How are you, Seth?
Good. Long
Good
time
to
Wow.
no
see
Hi,
see.
you.
Tracy.
Hi, Byron. Nice to see you.
Been a while.
Yes, quite a while.
Yeah, Sadek, I'm relieved.
Yeah, me too. I still need to figure out what happened because you, Carol, and Arthur as well got those messages.
Oh.
Very strange. I'll talk to
When would
IT
it have
people
come,
today.
Sadek?
Pardon me?
When did you get the message? Byron, when did
Sure,
that
last night, this morning,
Maybe
I
I
don't know
haven't even
exactly.
seen it.
I think I got it last night,
last night.
along with, it was immediately followed by a message announcing the meeting. So
Nope.
Okay. Very strange. But you were on a Harvard email address, right,
yeah,
Mike?
It's sort of a Harvard email address. It's mjh.harvard.edu.
Okay, so maybe. Anyway, I'll try to figure it out.
Usually those things go out to the whole list when they go out, the meeting adjustments.
Exactly.
Well, that's it. The message has gone out to everybody. Everybody got it, but a few people, so far I know of 3, received a version that says the meeting is canceled. And that's very strange. But then again, the internet works in mysterious ways. So.
We have a lot of people on.
Yeah, so
Hi,
it
Mary
seems
Jo.
good.
Hi, Mary Jo.
Hi there.
I barely see the top of your face.
Oh, yeah?
There we
And they
go.
Pull yourself down more.
Yeah, more.
I'm looking for myself. Oh, there.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Mary Jo.
Hi, Theogen.
Hi, Tracy.
Hi,
Hi,
Mary
Gilbert.
Jo.
Oh, I don't see Joe.
He's here.
They're always here.
You gotta put yourself on gallery view.
I see Tracy. I don't see Joe.
There's Joe
Oh, there
looking,
you
looking like a young man.
I'm always tempted.
Not
on-
feeling like one.
Oh, he's right there.
Me either. Me either.
Yeah, Joe has managed, by not being in this country, to be able to get a haircut. I haven't had a, I haven't had a hair, I haven't had a haircut since February.
Me either.
I used my beard trimmer actually, Byron.
Oh, I see.
You can't see the back of his head though, Byron.
Oh,
Don't want to see the back.
oh, okay.
I bought a trimmer, but it took a long time to come because I bought it in April.
Yeah.
They were all sold out.
When they were all sold out,
Oh.
same thing happened to me.
Byron bought one, but it's still sitting in the chair.
Put it in the box.
My first attempt was not so hot. It got better.
I had Ashley, our nephew's wife, cut the knots out of the back, but I haven't had a haircut since January. Except sometimes I go in and whack it myself.
I'm not even going to say anything and call attention to my hair.
Yeah, right. Hey, thank God you still have some.
Beautiful hair. Let's see.
Yeah, Sadek's one of the lucky ones.
I feel pretty self-conscious, actually.
Box I used to put under here.
Nobody can see the back or the top where I'm losing mine. It's good. Don't want to see it.
It's like Reza has gotten on. Can you hear us, Reza?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone.
Reza,
Pleasure to be here.
good to see you.
Reza with the best headshot of the bunch.
Yeah, well, he's famous for his headshots.
There you go.
Looks like Arthur has gotten on. Say hello, Joe.
Hi, Arthur. How are you?
There he is.
Well, I hope.
He's muted.
No, I'm glad to see Arthur is here because he's one of the people that received those cancellation notes.
Good to see you, Joe.
Hi,
Nice to see you.
Joe, does my mic work?
Yes, I hear you, Uli.
Okay, so my headset isn't working. I can hear you barely, but at least I can hear something, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we hear you very well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Uli, are you in Bhutan or are you in Europe now?
I'm in Austria, in Tyrol. I'm stuck here.
Right.
I'm sure not.
Uli worked with me in Bhutan and knows everybody in Bhutan.
It's a small enough country, you can get to know everybody, is that it?
Yeah, it's pretty small. Not even 1 million inhabitants, so it's quite.
Wow.
It's like the population of a large city in the US, maybe.
A
Right.
small city.
Yeah, small.
Mhm.
I see many of our MMSC students are here. Musa's here, Ralph is here. I think I saw Comfort earlier. Nagi is here.
Hi, Byron. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
I comfort.
Wan Yun. Nice to see you.
Hello.
So we should start in just maybe one more minute. We have about 50 people on. It's a good start.
My gosh.
Hi, Angela. So why don't shall I start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Say welcome to everyone for joining us for this Friday morning seminar. And we have the great pleasure of having an old friend and former fellow in our postdoc program all the way back from 2006 to 2008, Joe Calabreses. I actually first met Joe Calabreses when I went to the University of Chicago to the program in human development to give a talk once. And he was there, and I remember meeting him. He was a student there of one of my former teachers as well, Ray Fogelson, a psychological anthropologist who worked with American Indians. And that also was a pathway in a way that Joe himself followed. In those days, the program in human development allowed people or supported those who wanted to do a clinical track as well as a track in PhD research in human development. And Joe was trained both as a clinician there as well as an anthropologist, and went off to study with the Navajo Nation, the a whole ritual process involved with the use of peyote, a hallucinogenic drug, as part of the American Indian Church movement, and published a really wonderful book called A Different Medicine, Post-Colonial Healing in the Native American Church, which he published in 2013. And I just want to read what I wrote as a blurb for the back of that book. This remarkable clinical ethnography, and he's clear that his work, that he uses the term clinical ethnography to link up doing ethnography with clinical work. This remarkable clinical ethnography provides a deep experiential account of the Native American Church, its ritual forms, integration into the multi-generational lives of families, and therapeutic value in countering post-colonial disorders in a Navajo community. The book provides a searing critique of the continued criminalization of the sacramental use of peyote in NAC, North American Church rituals, demonstrating how the war on drugs recalls and perpetuates the colonial inquisition of Native peoples associated with the American Indian Holocaust. And so that's how I think of and place that body of work. Joe went on and also did clinical work in the same hospital that led to the book, that Janice Jenkins and Tom Chortis have published recently that we mentioned, talked briefly about, and from which some of their most recent work comes. Joe, you know, they presented in the seminar 2 weeks ago. And so it's a great pleasure. Over the years, I've followed Joe taking up a position at University College in London, then becoming head, actually developing their whole medical anthropology unit, carrying out research on experience-based, on how to use research on the experiences of patients as a mechanism for improving healthcare in London, but most recently has gone on to conduct research in Bhutan. And it's a great pleasure to actually finally hear about that work. I've seen bits and pieces of it. I've heard him talk very briefly about it, but this is the first time that we, I think, in this group will have a chance to hear of Joe's new work in Bhutan. So it's a great pleasure. He has with him one of his former PhD students who graduated from UCL with a PhD in 2019, Uli or Ulrika Chokol, and you can introduce her in more detail, but I know that she's been working for a quite long period of time in Bhutan, and I think it's terrific that you've both been able to work there and also guide students and collaborate with anthropologists who work more full-time in Bhutan. So I think with that, Joe, I'll pass it over to you and just say what a great pleasure it is to have you join us this morning.
Thank you so much, Byron. I really appreciate it, being able to be invited back to the Friday morning seminar. It's very important context for me throughout my development, and I'll be talking a bit about how you've influenced me, and also how clinical practice as part of fieldwork has influenced me. Uli is just a brilliant, wonderful comrade to have in the field, and she did a very important analysis of some central concepts in Bhutan in social anthropology, having to do with this concept that maybe we can get her to talk a bit about, Tunlam, which is harmonious relations, which includes with visible people and also non-human or other than human persons in the Navajo worldview. I mean, sorry, not Navajo, Bhutanese. So we'll get her to talk at a couple points to give some insight from her longer term research. I've worked for 4 summers as a clinical volunteer. So that gives me a particular vantage point, and I'll be talking about that. So thanks again, and I will share my screen and show you, be able to share with you some visuals from the work. Can you all see the slides? It's all right?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, so I'll discuss I have a couple goals for today. I wanted to discuss this new field site in Bhutan. I also want to reflect on some outcomes and implications of my larger decades-long experiment with an interdisciplinary identity, and especially a particular aspect of this approach that I refer to now as embedded clinical ethnography. And this, of course, is inspired by the work of Byron and Mary Jo and Arthur, Paul Farmer, and so many others in this group. And when I go to Bhutan, I embed myself as a member of the country's main mental health services team. I do hanging out in the community and traditional field work to familiarize myself with the local ways of life, and I practice as a clinical psychologist. This engaged positioning gives me local patients and clinical colleagues, as well as research subjects. And as I see it, this has altered the usual ethical priorities of fieldwork for me. I think traditional fieldwork mostly aims to be non-judgmental and has an ethics of empathy and intercultural understanding with a relativist suspension of judgment or evaluation. Clinical involvement, however, demonstrates that there are other more consequentialist ethical matters to worry about, such as patient health outcomes, diagnostic clarity, effective treatment choices, and all these call for defensible theory. And this brings me to another goal for my talk, which is to reflect a bit on my experiences since leaving the Department of Social Medicine in Harvard within British social anthropology, where the latest fashionable theoretical stance is called ontological anthropology. Given that the teacher of my fieldwork supervisor at Chicago was A.I. Hallowell, I have a particular relationship with this domain. Hallowell, of course, popularized anthropological studies of indigenous ontology, but he studied it in a way that I find a defensible manner that doesn't exclude the psychological dimension. He looked at it as a perceived worldview bound up with cognitive orientations shaped by culture, whereas the new ontological anthropology, it has a focus on other than human persons and local metaphysics of being, but takes away the psychological level of analysis. And I see this as reinforcing a repackaging of extreme relativism, elevating cultural worldviews to the status of literal reportage of independent physical universes, the reality of which we can't question lest we be called unethical, ethnocentric, imperialist, etc. So towards the end of the talk, I'll come back and focus a bit on ontologies and how we can understand them and what a clinical perspective on understanding ontologies might be. Bhutan has provided a fascinating natural experiment in relation to perennial charges that mental disorders are simply inventions of the West that have been exported. Note here I'm talking about patterns of disorder themselves, not just the labels we give the disordered patterns. These are obviously abstract descriptions we've constructed, though informed by scientific research. Beyond that are the actual biopsychological and behavioral states. What interested me about Bhutan, especially, is it hasn't been indoctrinated into Western psychiatric ideology. The mental health system was founded only in 1997, and it's still not the dominant approach to understanding and treatment of mental disorders. Spiritual understandings and ritual are dominant. And Bhutan was never colonized. It's remained relatively isolated from the West throughout its history. So as a practicing clinician with a lot of local patients, would I see radically different patterns of mental illness, or the same patterns to which I've become accustomed to elsewhere, or no mental illness, because Bhutan is a happy Buddhist Shangri-La? No mental illness would certainly support the cultural determinist and relativists arguments, and I'm certainly open to being convinced that a relativist argument might be appropriate in a certain case. After all, I published a book arguing that the Native American peyote ceremony is not simply believed to be effective, but actually is a sophisticated set of interventions within a culturally different paradigm that actually is effective. So these were open questions for me going into Bhutan. Are the presentations very different? Will Bhutanese patients respond to the standard psychological and psychiatric treatments as expected? Or are these approaches completely irrelevant? And what are the effects of healing rituals and the traditional medical system called Soa Rigpa? Are there healing practices already in place in Bhutan that might be useful? Let's enter the realities of my new field context in Bhutan through a single revelatory moment from my field notes. I'm in morning ward rounds at the country's main hospital in Thimphu, during which we as the clinical team review new patients and the progress of ongoing treatment, meeting 3 times per week. I'm looking at a tall and rugged Bhutanese woman. Her face is weathered and expressionless. She has a stoic, resigned set to her jaw. As she speaks to my colleague and host, the chief psychiatrist, Dr. Sencho, about her recent psychiatric relapse, a single tear rolls down her cheek. She's from a rural area of Bhutan where she's the second wife in a plural marriage. She had suffered from a severe and chronic psychotic disorder, but had responded well to monthly depot injections of an antipsychotic medicine, and she was stable for a long period. But then the supply of medicine from India became interrupted. It became unavailable, and she had a traumatic and destabilizing psychiatric relapse. Dr. Sencho gazes at her. She is charging me, he explains, because we didn't have her medication. So I ask myself, what sort of anthropological perspectives should we bring to such clinical encounters dealing with painful human emotions and vulnerabilities? Critical studies of the domination of Western pharmaceuticals, or critiques of the power differences between powerful clinicians and victimized patients, or relativist arguments that modern psychiatry is simply the local ethnopsychology of Western Europeans and Americans? These standard critical approaches to analysis all fall flat in the face of the real human suffering experienced by people with mental disorders and their search for appropriate treatments. So what sort of ethnographic approach do I think we should use to study such painful human realities? This has been a central question in my work, and I'll discuss it in the ways in which I see incorporating clinical practice into fieldwork has altered the way I answer this question. First, I now strongly feel that critiques of clinical practices and understandings shouldn't be ignorant of them, nor of the experiences of the local treatment teams, or the challenges of severe mental disorders. So I embed myself as a full-time member of locally run clinical teams, which allows me to become familiar with their understandings, as well as with the experiences of a large number of patients and their families. This allows for detailed observation of illness patterns, local therapeutic intervention and outcomes, patients' understandings of illness, therapeutic narratives, and the use of rituals or plant medicines. I've noted that this engaged perspective, balanced between anthropology and clinical psychology, has reoriented my ethical and theoretical priorities, which feeds into my teaching. With my students, who are often under the sway of the new ontological anthropology, or another repackaging of one-sided relativism, I use the word meta-relativism to indicate a relativized relativism, an approach that is open to finding surprising cultural differences, but equally open to acknowledging universal aspects of human experience, even in an exotic place like Bhutan. Another term I use trying to get at the same idea is scalable localism. But I use meta-relativism as a sort of paradoxical intervention with my students. This is an intervention in which the psychotherapist prescribes the problematic symptom to achieve a therapeutic effect. In my case, I argue the cure to facile relativism is actually more relativism. And this position is very much in the spirit of relativism. So a relative relativism, remaining open to pan-human realities, is actually a truer relativism than a rigid absolutistic relativism, which is self-refuting. How can one be a rigid absolutist relativist? If you say everything is relative, then so must that statement itself be relative. This suggests an interdisciplinary stance, which is especially crucial for understanding complex human realities of illness and treatment, and which is the ethical stance when lives are on the line. Intellectually, getting beyond the theoretical dichotomy between the traditional anthropological relativism and the psychological mapping and interpretation of locally observable clinical realities is exciting because it forces us to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. It forces us to do careful clinical ethnography in local contexts to figure out which aspects are relative or locally shaped and which simply reflect our common humanity. Finally, I seek a dialectical understanding in fieldwork through an approach I describe as dialectical challenge. I challenge anthropological perspectives with clinical perspectives and vice versa. I also challenge ethnographic experiences with contrasting ethnographic experiences. So for example, in my earlier field research in relation to my evolving relativist view of Native American peyote use, I deliberately sought immersion in contexts that could challenge and possibly disconfirm the relativist view. For example, undergoing years of training in diagnosis and treatment of substance abuse disorders, and incorporating clinical practice with Native Americans and other patients having very real problems with addiction and abuse. I think of this pattern of dialectical challenge, experiencing Native American substance abuse cases at the same time as studying peyote use, as doing counter-ethnography, generating not only counter-arguments, but counter-experiences. And this dialectical discovery-oriented stance directly opposes what I see as the repackaged anti-psychological relativism of the new ontological anthropology, which seems to always work towards a predetermined answer. So I chose Bhutan as another opportunity for a dialectical challenge of some anthropological ideas. Let's zoom out to introduce the field site a bit more. Bhutan is a Buddhist kingdom in the eastern Himalayas, wedged between China and India, with an officially recognized population of around 750,000. Given its location across several high mountain valleys and other factors, Bhutan has remained very isolated for most of its history, allowing television and internet only in 1999. Much of the country is rural, dotted with small villages and towns like Wangdi here. Bhutan was and still is ruled from massive fortresses called dzongs, which house government offices as well as the local monk body. The dzongs are also sites of religious festivals called sechus. They have a monarchy, and a common marriage pattern in Bhutan is for a man to marry several sisters. And this is a photo showing the previous king with his 4 queens who are all sisters. Bhutanese religion is strongly influenced by Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. And this form of Buddhism is characterized by frightening guardians and local deities considered to have been converted to Buddhism. Though the country is strongly Buddhist, most Bhutanese see the landscape as populated by many invisible entities, including deities and spirits with whom positive relations must be maintained to avoid illness and misfortune. Accumulation of merit is an important activity, which includes not only compassionate acts, but also a sort of mechanical generation of merit through circling shrines, as people are doing here at the National Memorial Chorten in Thimphu. And there's a story of a stray dog and a pig who chased each other round and around the shrine, with both achieving enlightenment because of the merit earned. Merit is also accumulated by spinning prayer wheels like this one. This photo was taken at a high school that my wife Tracy was observing. She's here with one of the school's Bhutanese teachers with whom she became friends, and they are wearing the traditional women's outfit. A central cultural concept which my student Uli has studied extensively is the concept of Tunlam, which always brings to mind the popular story in Bhutan of the four harmonious friends, four animals who cooperated to nurture a tree and were then able to enjoy the fruits. Uli, do you have any things you can share with us on the centrality of the concept of Tunlam?
Yeah, I have prepared a little bit about that for you.
Thank you.
Try to make it interesting for medical purpose. So Tunlam is translated as relationship and friendship in the Dzongkha dictionary. Tun means compatible, favorable, harmonious, agreeable, or appropriate, and lam means the way. So one can actually literally translate Tunlam as the harmonious or appropriate way. And to my interviewees, Tunlam means friendship and good connections. So it's really with a positive connotation. And they also told me that Tunlam with others is an important precondition to enable cooperation and mutual assistance in all aspects of life. Once Tunlam is established, loyalty follows, which was very important also during the times when Bhutan was still a full-fledged monarchy. So Tunlam is important for successful life in and harmony at all levels of society and for personal and communal well-being. And one has to understand that Bhutanese society is organized around principles of hierarchy and seniority, and this reflects in the different types of Tunlam maintained with humans, and as Joe already pointed out, with the Lha, the deities alike. So just to mention a few types of Tunlam, for example, the Tunlam between parents and their children, the Tunlam between siblings, the relationship between households, communities, and the local deities, the spiritual bond between spiritual master and disciples, the relationship between various levels of people, can be neighbors, and the relationship, again, relevant to pre-democratic Bhutan, between superiors and the subordinates, for example, between aristocrats and servants. So those are different types of Tunlam. And so in my own research, I realized that hospitality is a main mediating framework for many of these relationships, expressed through etiquette and manners, underpinned by ideas on what makes for a good host and guest based on Buddhist ethics. So from small to large scale ceremonial and non-ceremonial, mundane and religious hospitality events serve to renew Tunlam with the humans, local deities, and the wider community alike. Such events also provide the setting for a variety of exchange of food and drink, services and gifts, embedded in moral worldviews that emphasize Buddhist notions of generosity and compassion. So to draw a parallel between the treatment of guests and patients, I heard Bhutanese sayings that, for example, a lifelong sick person should be treated like a one-night guest. So to understand that, one has to know that there is another saying that states that a one-night guest is like a god. So ideally, a lifelong patient should be treated with the utmost compassion. And these are ideals, however, and everyday life is, of course, marked by the tension between mutuality and self-interest of people. And although there are deities and spirits inhabiting the landscape, they are just as flawed as humans and not considered enlightened beings. So they can be angry, envious, jealous, which can affect the well-being and mental health of human beings. So I just want to briefly talk about Tunlam with the local deities. So harmonious relationships have to be kept with the local deities. In the village, that means every village has their birth deities and local deities they have to keep relations with. That's been done through annual rituals like household rituals or community rituals, and even everyday things like offering incense in the morning. And furthermore, one must not pollute places where those deities are thought to dwell. So according to Bhutanese, an imbalance of these relationships can cause sickness and mental discomfort. In such cases, appeasement rituals need to be performed. They can be large and last for days. Some, they require religious specialists and they will go into warfare with the spirits, and others are very short and ad hoc. So usually when somebody gets sick, the village astrologer will be consulted about the cause of the sickness. Once the culprit is identified, the family will also be informed on what they have to do. In less severe cases, small appeasement rituals will suffice. I just want to conclude with a short example from what I personally call an instant ritual in a remote valley where I was based for my research. So I stayed at my friend's house, a villager in a very remote place. And one morning I came into the kitchen and I saw her lying on the floor with stomach cramps. She also told me that she had diarrhea. I was really worried and I suggested visiting the basic health unit nearby. However, she blamed it on a local spirit dwelling near the bridge not far from her house, apparently a hungry ghost. So what followed was an instant handling of the case, an instant ritual that complies to 3 phases I identified in hospitality events: reception, hosting, and farewell. So first she would pull out a little table and burn some incense, and then she would welcome the spirit. She would offer a cup of ara, which is the local, I think you call it moonshine, alcohol, and a cup of rice. And she, apparently most of these local deities and spirits have a preference for particular food items, particular scents, smells, or drink. And so this whole offering set the stage for then manipulating the spirit, so to say, gently talk the spirit into please leaving her be. And in case of such appeasement rituals do not work, villagers will eventually go to the medical treatment facilities, but parallelly might still continue with the rituals. In this case, it was just a very small one. It happens every now and then. It's actually something that you come across very frequently when you stay with local people. Yeah, so I hope it wasn't too long. I just wanted to add my own experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Uli. We experienced a little breaking up of your connection, but hopefully you can
I'm so
continue
sorry.
to hear. That's all right. It was only toward the end. So I'll continue. So far, I've spent, as I said, 4 summers in Bhutan, and I spend it in the capital city, Thimphu. Bhutan is undergoing a high level of rural to urban migration to Thimphu. And this is changing patterns of work, gender roles, and patterns of illness. And the capital city is experiencing many new problems, such as disruptive youth and significant substance abuse problems. Actually, alcoholism is the #1 cause of death at the hospital where I volunteer. Alcoholic drinks have been central to Bhutanese social relations for a long time, but the amounts produced were limited. However, today, trucks full of cheap liquor from India roll in unlimited quantities. Just to give you a feel of Thimphu, this is one of the main streets in the city center. You'll notice that stray dogs are everywhere, sleeping in the middle of the street often because they don't have anything to fear, as everyone takes pains to avoid hurting them. However, they bark and cavort all night, which makes sleep difficult. The nearby Clock Tower Square is a common meeting place. When I go to Bhutan, I work closely with the country's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Tsencho, treating psychiatric patients and training clinical staff in the country's main hospital, working primarily with adult patients having episodes of severe mental disorders. Health system is slowly modernizing, owing much to support from India as the patron. Medical treatment is provided free by government, and there were only 2 permanent psychiatrists for the country and a handful of psychiatric nurses. No clinical psychologists and very little psychotherapy. So the system, as is typical, relies heavily on medicine with some psychoeducation for detoxing drug and alcohol patients. And while I was there, we started also an anxiety group because many people had panic. The mental health system was launched only in 1997 with the opening of the psychiatry unit at Jigme Dorjin Wangchuk National Referral Hospital. An inpatient psychiatry ward was opened in 2004, and I started working in 2011, 7 years after the inpatient ward was opened. Patients are admitted with a family member who cares for them, makes sure they're fed, and manages their behavior. The inpatient ward wasn't locked and there was no security. However, extremely violent patients could have the door on their room locked if they were a danger to other patients, as sometimes they were. With the launching of the mental health system, Bhutan introduced modern mental health practices into communities that until then had relied solely on traditional forms of treatment, mainly rituals led by shamans, and to a lesser extent, traditional medicines or appealed to astrologers or monks. By far, the most typical approach to mental disorders is the shaman. And this is a 5-hour-long ritual that Uli and I attended for a hospital colleague's lower back pain, which he interpreted as due to a lost component of his soul. The aim of such rituals is to negotiate with the attacking spirit, make offerings of food to it, and convince it to release its hold on the victim. So you'll notice the altar is lined with tormas. These are ritual cakes made from dough or butter, usually in a conical shape, served as offerings to the divinities. A recent major ritual led by the country's spiritual leader offered coronavirus-shaped tormas to the powerful protector deity to be devoured. Getting back to the ritual, hours of shamanistic performance in trance culminated in the location of a spider, an animal that captures its prey, which is placed on the head of the patient to signify that the life force has been returned from its captor. In addition to this sort of understanding of soul loss as responsible for illness, some illness is attributed to witchcraft or black magic, and some entire families in Bhutan are labeled poison givers, and people are told not to take any food from them or their descendants. And the king himself tried to dispel the stigma resulting from this belief by accepting ara, a local homemade alcoholic beverage, from those ostracized as poison givers. Spirit possession is often another explanation of mental disorders. The other main options for treatment don't really offer viable treatments for severe mental illness. The traditional medical system, Soa Rigpa, will likely diagnose a problem with the wind humor, lung, and they do associate some herbal preparations with mental disorders or mental sounding sorts of things. I identified 7 medical mixtures, and I did a quick analysis of the ingredients, which revealed that 6 contain Mystrica fragrans, a weak MAO inhibitor, and 5 contain Aquilaria, which is a CNS depressant. So these medicines are probably mildly psychoactive, but not necessarily suitable for treating severe mental disorders. I was curious about what Buddhism experts in Bhutan think about mental disorders, so I visited this monastery brought by a clinical coworker who knows the head monk. And it was a remarkably prototypical experience of climbing up the mountain to visit a Himalayan monastery to ask a question. When we got to the top after a short communal meditation, I had the opportunity to ask the head monk how they viewed mental illness. And his reply was, really, you guys down there at the hospital are the experts. And in fact, we have a monk up here who's been acting strangely, and I wonder if you could have a chat with him. So not only was this somewhat anticlimactic in relation to the romantic Himalayan stereotype, but they put me to work doing an evaluation. The take-home point is they didn't claim to have any treatments for severe mental disorders. So I wanted to share some clinical cases. My finding generally is we definitely see very classic looking cases of psychiatric illnesses we see elsewhere. But they're explained almost invariably in terms of spirit possession, soul loss, black magic, being punished by a deity, or ultimately as due to karma. Even given the local interpretations, however, I saw familiar disorders. Even though most of the population hasn't adopted modern psychiatric interpretive frameworks, I saw classic symptoms of psychotic disorders, mood disorders, mania, panic attacks, alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide from various regions of the country. During my second summer of fieldwork, I treated a young man from a relatively isolated area of Western Bhutan, initially complaining of distressing thoughts, causing pain inside his body, making him weak. He was a student and he couldn't study. After a while talking with him, I discovered he ruminates if he has negative thoughts about another person. When he sees friends smoking, chewing betel, or acting negatively in some other way, he has negative thoughts about them, and he obsesses about these negative thoughts and feels he has to neutralize them. When he has the thought that's a negative person, not acting true to their cultural values, he neutralizes this thought by thinking of a good person in his mind. And so his mind often has an ordered group of people from bad, good, so that each bad one is paired in his mind with a good person to neutralize the badness. Our abstract description of this sort of pattern would be an obsessive compulsive disorder with a mental ritual. And his behavior of neutralizing the negative thoughts is a compulsive ritual. And I treated a case actually very similar to this one while at the Cambridge Hospital. We also saw a good amount of dissociative disorders and conversion disorders, maybe more than we see in the West. The dissociative states were typically interpreted as spirit possession, and we successfully treated many cases that were interpreted as spiritual in origin using psychological and psychiatric methods. I'll describe a case initially interpreted in spiritual terms that was treated with rituals unsuccessfully for several weeks before the patient was finally brought to the psychiatric ward. This was a lady in her mid-30s who runs a hotel in central Bhutan, who had worked very hard during a 3-day period and became ill. Her family stated she hadn't slept in 8 days. She didn't want to stay in the house and kept leaving, going for walks. But more troubling, she was speaking in a foreign sounding voice, saying that she had been mistreated. And she was identifying details of a girl who died who had worked at another hotel. So the family saw this as a pattern of possession by a shindi, or a dead spirit. I interpreted the case in terms actually of what I learned about spirit possession in anthropological writings, especially about places like Africa. Classic anthropological theory in this area is that it seems that people become possessed when they're chronically disempowered and then experience an acute stress. So it seemed likely to me that, as in studies of the Tsar cult by I.M. Lewis and Janice Bodie, our Shindy case was a destabilized woman's dissociated cry for help in a voice that her community would take notice of, that of an invading spirit. Her treatment involved encouraging her family to be patient and support her without making any demands, along with plenty of rest and some medicines to help her relax. And this eventually brought her out of the episode and back to her original personality. Patients generally responded as expected, which is not perfectly, even when the illness seemed to be very spiritual in nature to them. And there usually wouldn't be an awareness that the treatment that we offered had helped. So for example, we had the case of a young man with catatonia being brought into the ward by his father. His body was very stiff and he was unresponsive. He could only respond in a whisper. And his father was very loving and trying everything he could, but he interpreted his son's condition in religious terms. Again, he thought the illness was caused by a shindi, the spirit of a dead person. And he kept seeking rituals to cure his son. He was a southern Bhutanese, so he began with Hindu pujas and then added Buddhist rituals. And when these didn't work, he became Christian and tried church. Then he finally brought his son to the hospital, but still had trouble accepting that his son's condition was due to an untreated mental disorder. The treatment team put his son on an antipsychotic medication, and this eventually lifted the catatonia. Several weeks later, I saw the father and son when they came in for a follow-up appointment. Son was looking much better. He was able to smile, and the catatonia had lifted. However, the father pulled me aside and asked me if his mixing of different religious traditions was the thing that prolonged the illness. Even though I tried to explain over and over, he couldn't understand or accept that the problem was due to a long untreated mental disorder and that the psychiatric medication was what was helping his son. And a year later, when I returned the next summer, the son was back in the ward again with catatonia. This persistent tendency to view mental illness in spiritual rather than psychiatric terms led some in the psychiatry department to feel we treat the patients and solve the problem, but the improvement is then attributed to the rituals finally working. Even in a peaceful Buddhist society like Bhutan, psychotic homicides also take place. And I completed an evaluation on one such case, a man who tragically stabbed his wife to death in response to voices. And I heard about several other cases. We had another young man on the inpatient ward who was nonstop violent, ripping to shreds anything he got his hands on in the ward after doing the same at home. And we had to give him, put him in a room in the ward that was able to be padlocked. And then he proceeded to try to tear the walls apart inside that room. Dr. Tsencho tried to open the door a bit to talk with him, and he grabbed and destroyed Tsencho's eyeglasses. I can't even remember how the staff were able to medicate him, but he eventually calmed down. Among the most anxiety-provoking patients were those near death from alcohol abuse. These problems are very severe, and alcohol-related liver failure, as I said, is the #1 cause of death at the hospital. Hospital had a lot of patients detoxing from alcohol or other substances, sometimes with psychotic symptoms due to withdrawal, and the standard practice was to use diazepam. I really wanted to get public health messages out about the dangers of detoxing on your own, as well as the danger I noted of the abuse of an over-the-counter painkiller called spasmoproxivon. Spasmoproxivon is among the most abused substances by young people in Bhutan, which is unfortunate because the pill bundles together a deadly combination of the opioid tramadol with paracetamol. So you become addicted to the opioid in the pill. So you consume more and more paracetamol, which in sufficient dose is a deadly liver poison. So I saw a lot of young Bhutanese with wrecked livers. I consulted people in the community about how to get out effective public health messaging, and I was told adding dramatic performance and music will effectively draw attention to messages. Luckily, Uli knew people in the arts, so I used some British Academy funding to hire a group of actors and musicians. We collaborated on a script dramatizing these risky situations, and we put on an educational street theater in the main vegetable market in Thimphu. We also gave some messaging about first aid for epilepsy. As nurses in the inpatient unit told me, epilepsy is widely considered contagious, so people often block others from approaching someone who has had a seizure. And I played the role of a character called Dr. Joe, trying to slip in some medical education in between the songs and performances. Hospital staff did a lot of work to try to explain to patients the significance of their dangerous liver test results. In an attempt at culturally consonant confrontational treatment, the chief psychiatrist would often send patients with life-endangering alcoholism on darshan to see their Maha gurus, patients in the medical units dying from cirrhosis. Preventing deaths from alcohol use is very challenging because sharing alcoholic beverages is really at the heart of Bhutanese sociality and its gestures of hospitality, and is also at the center of Bhutanese Buddhist rituals. And this problem is, of course, also exacerbated by rapid urbanization and social change. Many people run bars in Thimphu to generate income, and there are several hundred in the city. I'll always remember one young man with whom I worked for months, including meeting with his friends who were trying to support him after his discharge. His liver was in really bad shape. As I was on my way to the airport on the last day of a visit to Bhutan, I encountered him in the main city at a large festival, completely drunk in the middle of the day. He tried to get in my taxi with me, but I had to tell him that I was on the way to the airport in Paro. I also found myself providing a lot of family and couples therapy for very familiar problems associated with urban living and nuclear families, including family arguments, absent partners, women feeling stuck at home, domestic violence, jealousy, out of control adolescence, all exacerbated by alcohol use. So my basic conclusion, after years of treating, 4 summers of treating Bhutanese patients, is that the evidence doesn't really support a strongly relativist argument, other than perhaps a greater amount of somatized presentations and dissociative and conversion disorders. What stands out, especially given Bhutan's long isolation and lack of colonial history, is an argument for species-wide patterns of mental disorder that coexist with a relatively independent stream of spiritual interpretations and responses. So it's not good enough to simply agree with the most traditional local understandings and attack all deviations as ethnocentric or imperialist. And this is also the opinion of my Bhutanese colleagues. In fact, the story of the chief psychiatrist, Sencho, with whom I co-authored an initial paper, is very instructive. Growing up, Sencho witnessed his older brother becoming psychotic. His brother was initially a very gifted pupil and entered the monkhood at the age of 13. However, he was later sent home from his training he began showing out of control behavior, including charging at his younger brothers with a knife. Seeking to protect their family, but still care for the eldest brother, Sancho's parents locked the brother in a storage room on the second floor of their large farmhouse. His meals were slid through a hole in the door, and an opening was cut in the floor through which he could defecate. And Sancho's brother lived like this for over 10 years. This is a common local response to mental illness by Bhutanese families who have a dangerously out of control relative they don't know how to manage. They may also be chained, at least in the hope that they won't harm themselves or others or wander into the jungle and starve. But many of these people with treatment could live outside of a cage. Sancho's family assumed that his brother was possessed by deities, and they performed several rituals which didn't help. Sancho later underwent medical training and became exposed to psychiatry via Dr. Murthy from Bangalore. They tried his brother on an antipsychotic medication, and finally something had worked to improve his status. His brother is now able to live with Sancho's family safely, though certain symptoms remain. He didn't, however, have to spend his life boxed up in the same room. This experience led Sancho to struggle with the bureaucracy in Bhutan to gain training to become the first Bhutanese psychiatrist and help build the current mental health system, as under-resourced as it still is. So the situation in Bhutan is marked by a cultural paradigm clash between modern ways of understanding mental disorders and traditional spiritual understandings, which often delay or interfere with the more effective treatments and more humane ways of ensuring safety. In a public psychiatry context for severe mental illnesses specifically, I don't see how local spiritual interpretations are deeply relevant to diagnostic clarity or offer effective treatment for major mental disorders, though taking local understandings into account certainly may be useful in terms of patient engagement. For this, taking this stance, which I see as simply a reasonable finding from clinically engaged ethnography, I feel I'm often seen as a heretic by students and other adherents of the new ontological anthropology, which I should clarify I have no problem with when it's applied to areas like art, aesthetics, or religion, where there's arguably no territory for which there's a demonstrable correct mapping. However, this style of argument is moving into the sphere of diseases and disorders, and I have an ethical problem with that. Cohen and Lynch, for example, recently introduced these new theoretical approaches to medical anthropology in a special issue of Anthropology and Medicine, pushing the position that reality might not be universal, though it's not at all clear what this means or entails. What does seem clear is that all we can acknowledge in their view are alternate claims about reality, which we have to equally respect and certainly not test or evaluate. No particular world can exist prior to its observation, they argue, because no world can be accorded with the status of existence other than through some kind of interaction with it. And to me, this simply conflates territory and map. As an example, the authors discuss pregnancy and assert that because there are different definitions of when a pregnancy is acknowledged to have started, and because the English language distinguishes pregnant from non-pregnant, we must question the binary of pregnant versus non-pregnant as biological states. In addition, new over-the-counter pregnancy tests allowing results sooner after conception are claimed to change not simply one's knowledge that one is pregnant, but the reality that emerges, somehow demonstrating the fact that there are no definitive states or categories relating to the body, which I find incoherent. Similar line is taken by Anna Marie Moll, for whom there's no disease called atherosclerosis, only multiple enactments or ways of doing atherosclerosis. Again, I see a reduction to phenomenology or the insider's point of view. Moll is not really discussing atherosclerosis and how it's multiple, but about multiple ways of representing it. However, for a deep-sounding theory, ideas of representation or real object are repudiated. So everything is a unique local construction done differently by different local actors including a buildup of plaque in the patient's arteries, pointing out how one or another does the patient's atherosclerosis seemingly becomes for too many a deep theoretical innovation rather than a grammar error. Many of my students in medical anthropology at UCL are clinicians. Should I teach this to them? How could this position contribute to effective and ethical practice? Clinicians enact a situation as a disorder, another group enacts it as a spiritual matter, and we're done. No actual situation is there beyond our enactments, so there are no treatment recommendations. Given my experiment with an interdisciplinary dual identity and the consequent reorientation of my ethics through taking on clinical responsibilities as a part of research, how do I understand ontologies and their relations to bodies? How can I theorize ontology from a more Hallowellian perspective, incorporating the psychological level of analysis and a clinical psychological lens? Obviously, some postulated cultural entities and processes are experienced subjectively as realities. However, others are not, and this was demonstrated by the diverse opinions I found among Navajos in relation to the personhood of peyote, with some stating they understood this personhood as metaphorical. An acknowledgement of intracultural variation like this would seemingly be incompatible with the assumption that we've stepped into a coherent alternative universe and suggests we adopt a psychological anthropology of ontology. It's especially unbelievable to me that we can treat collective understandings only as pointing to an alternative universe without appreciating the psychoactivity of cultural meaning. This aspect of meaning was made clear throughout my clinical training and practice. Experiences of training and practice using cognitive therapy, for example, as well as psychodynamic frameworks were striking in that the target of intervention was the patient's interpretive framework, and a change in meanings could lead to a change in mood states and symptoms. This link between narrative structure and psychological states became even more striking during my training and practice in clinical hypnosis at the Cambridge Hospital. Cultures, including the domains of culture we call ontologies, are not simply referential. They're also psychoactive, dynamically shaped in relation to psychological vulnerabilities and needs, and able to alter and manage mood states, as well as our general orientation to reality. Cultural meanings may provide affordances for use in ways that are metaphorical, emotionally expressive, subjunctive, functional, symptomatic, didactic, manipulative, or even therapeutic. We suffer from mental disorders, but also from fundamental existential narrative ruptures that our ontologies help paper over. In a recent talk I gave at the Freud Museum in London, I argued that the most basic encompassing vector of psychopathogenesis encompasses uncomfortable truths arising from the distinct affordances of human biopsychological functioning and existence as self-aware finite beings, including such things as memory, awareness of our own finite nature, and of inevitable loss, and that we tend to banish these truths from awareness. And the most basic form of psychotherapeutic intervention may be narrative prostheses, which bridge the narrative chasms created by these banished truths. Therapeutic narrative structures that are built into and help structure the very cultural frameworks with which we think and interpret the world and ourselves. And this constitutes an important part of my theoretical understanding of culture, and it's supported not only by classic psychoanalytic anthropology, but findings from experimental psychology. But I won't go into those there because I'm cognizant of the time. What I will do is talk about one area of effective spiritual intervention in Bhutan that it seems to me has to do with the structure of culture. And this is the role of the concept of karma in the fabric of Bhutanese self-understandings and ontology. I should say here that a prominent theme in my research is therapeutic emplotment. And here I'm, of course, influenced by Mary Jo and by Cheryl Mattingly. And I use the word emplotment, perhaps more in the manner of Hayden White to mean an act of placing events or people into a story, particular plot structure or narrative framing. Therapeutic emplotment is when events are placed into a story that's therapeutic or intended to be therapeutic. My work extends this concept to a collective level. So I've used the term culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment to refer to the situation in which therapeutic narrative structures come to form the very fabric of culture meaning, so that culture becomes the omnipresent vehicle for therapeutic intervention. I think it's crucial to see therapeutic emplotment also as a collective social activity. And this constitutes my basic approach to understanding the clinical relevance of cultural meaning structures, including ontologies. The structure of culture also emplots in ways that are less improvised in each situation than preordained by tradition. The narrative of karma, which is very prevalent in Bhutan, promises a life after this one, even though it may be in a very dissimilar form. Stories help build this up as an experienced reality. For example, Sencho tells a story of his little niece, who, while a little girl, would run around stealing people's alcoholic drinks, drinking them and saying things like, "My wife says I drink too much," which was interpreted as leftover memories from a previous existence as an adult male drinker. Karma also assures people that the universe is just and that beings will be punished or rewarded in the next life for actions in this one. One's misfortune in this life can also be attributed through the law of karma to doings in one's previous existence. For example, if one is blind, this may be attributed to an immoral act in a previous existence involving one's eyes. A Bhutanese friend who's visually impaired told me that seeing his blindness in terms of his own actions in a past life means he doesn't blame his parents for the condition, and his blindness was attributed by doctors to a nutritional deficiency in childhood, so he could have blamed his parents for not feeding him better. This was a surprising recognition of the social functions of karma narrative by someone inhabiting the narrative. So it seems that this feature of local culture has a therapeutic effect on social relations, functioning as a sort of overarching, omnipresent cognitive intervention, helping to produce a relatively sane and nonviolent society in Bhutan, though certainly not preventing severe mental disorders. Karma as emplotment seems to trigger feelings of compassion and acceptance, also fostering a level of trust in the society. I was once waiting to cross a busy street, and a Bhutanese man quickly walked past me into traffic saying, "It's okay, they don't want the bad karma of hitting you." So karma operates as a sort of morally evaluative panoptical invigilator, though an impersonal one. The deities and the spirits provide a more personal panoptical gaze. Other therapeutic affordances of Bhutanese culture seem to include the therapeutic expressive aspects allowed in spirit possession, the focus on maintaining tunlam or harmonious relationships, and the emplotment of death rituals, one of which I attended, which emplots loss of a loved one as a gradual process of letting go over a period of 49 days. When I reflect on my experiences with embedded clinical ethnography in Bhutan and the Navajo Nation, what's most apparent to me is a multiplicity of the normal and the therapeutic, along with a significant non-relativity of mental disorders as a demonstrable etic phenomenon. Especially after working in Bhutan, I'm more convinced than ever of the basic similarity of symptom patterns and the de-exoticized common humanity that I share with my patients. Even though local emic interpretations are variable, local interpretations don't equal observable symptom patterns. In addition, what some might consider the culturally appropriate treatments can be ineffective or harmful for certain conditions. The practice of embedded clinical ethnography for me has been associated with a distinctively clinical approach to culture theory, interpreting the narrative structure of culture in terms of its therapeutic affordances. Humans coordinate meaning making in terms of shared symbolic and narrative templates, and these abstractions are still linked to human bodies and thus shaped by human needs. So the theory of culture I'm trying to develop views it as in part a system of culturally embedded therapeutic affordances, including narratives. The narrative structure of culture and much of our perception of reality is not simply about representations of reality, but dynamically related to human emotional needs and states of health. Collective frameworks for meaning making are thus shaped not only by the effects of power, as critical theorists argue, but also by the effects of therapy. Clinical ethnography has also led me to an expanded understanding of mental health and psychotherapeutic intervention. Mental health is not simply the absence of overt pathology, it's also a creative emplotment. And psychotherapeutic intervention is so generic an aspect of human life as to be built into the very narrative structure of culture that forms the basis of our thinking. Culturally embedded therapeutic emplotments immerse entire societies in therapeutic narratives and act intergenerationally as omnipresent cognitive therapy. Cultures are psychoactive because meanings are psychoactive, pragmatically related to psychological vulnerabilities and needs of embodied people. One final takeaway from clinical ethnography: I feel that sometimes our common humanity gets lost in all the fetishizing of cultural difference. This common humanity was illustrated in my research in unexpected cross-cultural parallels between my two field sites, such as the Bhutanese woman possessed by a Shindi, whose experience seemed to mirror Sudanese women possessed by the Tsar spirit. And I later learned that the Bhutanese woman's Shindi possession also occurred as her husband was seeking a second wife, which is also common in Tsar. So this was a parallel with Africa and Bhutan. I noted other parallels between the field sites. So I described my Bhutanese hospital colleague, the visually impaired doctor, who told me that karma meant he didn't blame his parents for his blindness. During my doctoral fieldwork, I invited my Navajo colleague, Hosky, who's also visually impaired, to give a talk with me at the University of Chicago. In the talk, Hosky shared that he received 2 diagnoses for why he lost his vision. He said his Anglo doctor's diagnosis was retinitis pigmentosa, while his Navajo diagnostician told him that while Hosky was in his mother's womb, his father hunted and killed a deer, which created a conflict between giving and taking life. One of my teachers at Chicago, Richard Schwader, began to interrogate Hosky in a rather rough manner, asking him if, given what he shared, he blamed his father for his blindness. Hosky seemed somewhat puzzled and answered that he didn't blame his father, after which Schwader continued to press him for a while more, stating he couldn't see how he didn't blame his father. This second cross-cultural parallel, I believe, reveals 2 functioning systems of culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment, sharing a similar, seemingly counterintuitive exoneration of blame, and again suggesting similar human patterns in very distinct societies. I'll conclude by saying that I believe clinically engaged medical anthropology can provide not only a crucial reality check for theory generated in social anthropology, but a balancing of the ethics of intercultural etiquette with an ethics of medical consequence and professional responsibility. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions. Perhaps with the questions, we can bring Uli again to share.
Thank you very much, Joe. Maybe you want to unshare your screen, as delightful as the photos have been, and we can draw some people into this. Maybe before I ask Uli to comment again, I'd like to ask 2 people who have done related work in Nepal, actually. Eric Jacobson and Dr. Tony Pham. Eric, would you, since you've also back in the days, did a great deal of work that's quite closely related to this about the relationship between psychiatric categories and local Buddhist and demonic possession frames of healing. Would you like to comment here a bit?
Yeah, quite interesting presentation, Joe. The whole dynamic that seems particularly to do with the context in England, the intellectual standoff there. I was surprised ethnographically that there didn't, from your account, there didn't seem to be more classical Tibetan medicine in Bhutan, which is what I studied in Nepal. It's quite a sophisticated, about 1,000-year-old text-based tradition in terms, sophisticated in terms of a elaborate multi-herbal pharmacopoeia and diagnostic system. Maybe it's not there in Bhutan, or maybe your orbit just didn't run into it. But and when I was clinic sitting and looking for patients with mental disorders in the classical Tibetan practices in Darjeeling and Gangtok, actually, it was pretty clear to me, and I was studying the classical Tibetan diagnostic framework, and also because I was in psychiatric anthropology at Harvard, I had learned to do a SCID formal diagnosis. And so there was a matchup between certain classical Tibetan diagnoses and depression and anxiety, and even panic attack. People scored very highly on those things. And those people, to the extent that I could follow them up, often seemed to get better. Of course, they weren't just taking the herbal medicine, they were doing meditation and going to the temple and making offerings and things too. But it was very clear, even from the classical physicians, if somebody had psychotic symptoms, they would send them to the exorcist, because there were lamas who specialized in that. And the few that I picked up that had psychotic symptoms would orbit around between the herbal doctor, the exorcist, and the psychiatrist. And they just go around in that circle. And they seem to get a little bit better, maybe, but never completely cured. So that was one thing. The other thing is, I wonder if working so much in the psychiatric clinic gives you a sample that's somewhat selective, about what's going on there. Because I mean, you're running in very intensively into people who are recalcitrant to any other kind of treatment. And the final thing I wanted to say is, it's disappointing to me that that's the climate in England. Because of course in the US, we all run into this thing about absolute relativism, or that there's just one reality. And many of us have eventually been influenced by what's called, I think, pragmatic empiricism, which is there are different ways of engaging the world. It's not just interpretation, of course, people are interested in what works. But there's not necessarily one way, but that isn't the same as absolute relativism, because you can assess what works and what doesn't work according to what you and your society want to achieve. And I found that the classical Tibetan medicine seemed to work for anxiety and depression, but even the practitioners know it doesn't work for psychosis.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be in touch with you, Eric. I don't think we saw too much of each other when I was at Harvard. But I will say that Soa Rigpa is very much a part of the public health care offered to patients for free in Bhutan. And the situation is, as you describe it, that they will go here, go there, go to the regular hospital, go to the traditional hospital to see what works, go to the shaman and avail themselves of all these things. I spoke to traditional medicine doctors, and none of them felt that they had a well-developed approach to severe mental illness. It certainly might be the case, as I mentioned, for one thing, some of the plants used, the nutmeg plant, for example, is a mild MAO inhibitor, so it does have antidepressant effects. So it may be very well possible that some of these medical traditional medicine mixtures have some sort of an efficacy. And of course, everything else that's a part of the efficacy of the ritualism and the seeing holy men and all this is certainly a part of it as well. And I think that we can see that as the different approach that sometimes works. They usually would say that the problem is lung and wind humor problem, and then they would give medicine accordingly. But I certainly agree with your statement that I'm coming from a very specific place as a clinician at the public psychiatry team. And that's why I kind of always give a caveat that I'm doing a specific type of ethnography. And this gives me, I think, a different orientation that's a partial orientation, but that maybe provides a useful piece of the puzzle in seeing, maybe for one thing, a great number of patients from all different areas of the country, which maybe you wouldn't get if you were doing local ethnography in one village, as well as talking to the treatment team and learning from, say, Sancho and his experience with his brother. So thank you very much for that. I tend to agree.
So let's ask Tony. Tony Pham, are you on? Would you like to introduce yourself briefly? You're going to be talking in a couple of weeks here about your own research, but I wonder if you would like to just briefly introduce yourself to this group and make a few comments on Joe's presentation.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. My name is Tony Pham. I'm a postdoc under Dr. Joseph Gahn. Joe Calabreses is a name I've heard many times, so it's really exciting to hear your talk finally. And obviously work in Nepal is very related to work in Bhutan. I'm a psychiatrist by training, but it seems like recently I've been more of a researcher, so I'm still suffering from an identity crisis. I did have a reflection that I'd like to hear of on your work that I'd like to hear your opinion on, and it's something to do with the aspect of clinical ethnography. Actually, when I was working in Nepal, I kind of actually had a different approach. It was more sort of almost super non-clinical ethnography, and it was because I felt that as soon as people found out I was a psychiatrist, the dynamic between me and the community was very different. People were seeing me more as biomedical, unwilling to talk about traditional aspects of healing, which was the focus of my research. And so in some sense, I found there was a kind of recalcitrance when people came to know me as sort of like a biomedically oriented person. And I particularly reflected on that when you told me, or you told us about your account of, going on top of the trek and having that kind of anticlimactic revelation when the monks told you, you guys are the experts. I was wondering if you had this impression that sometimes people were holding back in terms of their own representations of reality and illness when talking with them about their conceptions of such because of your background with clinical work.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It may be the case, although I would say that there were also quite a lot of patients who were very open with me outside of the hospital as well as in the hospital about the postulated spiritual causes for their problem. And it may be because that still is the number one way of understanding these things in the country, whereas I don't know, in Nepal, I don't know what the situation is as far as the status of psychiatry. But in Bhutan, it's very much relatively new. It's not necessarily understood even by other medical staff. They tend to maybe assume that Dr. Sencho is a bit batty because he hangs around with psychiatric patients himself. And, so I think maybe in Bhutan, they were much freer to share the spiritual understanding within many contexts. As I say, I tried to combine, full-time work in the unit with hanging out as well in the community and traveling around a couple different places in Bhutan and meeting different people. And it did seem that, of course, everything we're told is a partial part of the story. So I agree, certainly in that way.
So Joe, I'm going to ask several people perhaps to comment and see if we can engage a number of people as we move forward with the amount of time we have. Did me that Jasvant has spent a reasonable amount of time working in Nepal. Wonder if she would like to comment. Then I want to get both Arthur and Mike Fisher, who has been writing, who's taken on these issues of ontology, and Arthur, who over the years has taken on these similar related issues about, so that perhaps I'd like to call on those three people next. Jasvant?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My only comment on Nepal is really related to children, because I noticed that one of the things that you talked about is the movement of people into the large center of the capital is actually giving you an inside view of culture change and how, and this is very important in Nepal because there's been a migration of fathers out to work out of the country, and the shifting because of poverty of culture change. And you said one of the groups that is very affected by this is youth. And so there's this whole area of trafficking, for example, that has become a very big issue in Nepal, and the absence of fathers, and the remainder of the taboos on menstruation, which have continued to result in rape and even death of some women in these huts. And these are tensions in the society. And along with it, the beginning of the advent of the idea of youth protection, that is, can the state actually intervene? These are actually about new conversations and new dialogues, and I think it positions a new conversation. So I don't think I can add to what you said, but I think it's very fascinating. Also in India, this has come up a lot. The tensions between the patriarchy and the traditional denial of many issues, which is so important in terms of social suffering, and particularly for children, where of course in the cities we see the rise of disorders becomes the same as in the West, in the urban settings of India. So I'm just commenting from that point of view that this is also an interesting dialogue about culture change.
Certainly, thank you very much. And one thing I would say quickly is that young people in Bhutan now are the education system now is trying to train them to be office, professionals, but the jobs aren't there in the country. And they no longer want to do the agricultural work. They want to hang out in the capital city, have a cosmopolitan lifestyle. They get disappointed when they can't have that, and then that's when you see a lot of the delinquency and substance abuse. And the same happens with nuclear families who don't have the extended family to monitor them, so that the husband goes off to work, he gets jealous when he's not around the wife, there's domestic violence. So we see these sorts of things happening, certainly with the rural to urban migration underway.
Some of you may know that Mike Fisher has been engaged in this debate over the quote ontological turn in anthropology, and that you took on directly here, Joe. Michael, do you want to come in and add some comments here?
first of all, Joe, thank you for a really wonderful presentation. Lots of things to think about. And I was particularly intrigued by your effort, and maybe Arthur will have something more to say about it as well, about your formulation of psychoactive meanings and psychoactive approaches to culture. I think that's potentially a very fertile kind of formulation to use. Exactly how to unpack it is a complicated problem, as you point out. About the ontology stuff, I'm intrigued by your experience in the British scene, which I've not really had experience in, and I'd like to hear more about, and maybe I'll pursue it a little bit. My own approach, where I'm coming from in terms of the ontological turn debate is really from the Brazilian material and Viveiros de Castro's effort, which I find politically dangerous and detrimental to the people that he claims to be defending, particularly the indigenous tribes of the Amazon, because I don't see that ontological turn in the way that he and Latour has picked it up, and Meillassoux, the son of the anthropologist, the philosopher Meillassoux, the way that those folks have picked it up is not an extreme relativism. I see it as an old-fashioned Orientalism of really othering people and imposing on them rigidified interpretations of cosmologies. So the whole notion that Amazonian Indians are predatory in their cosmological structure not only is itself an old debate about the Yanomami in particular that's been going on for over 40 years now, in a very detrimental way to the local populations. It's sorry, I lost the thought, the other thought.
You were talking about othering.
Right. Well, it is othering. It's an imposition on them. Oh, the predators, if one wants to argue about predation, the predators are the capitalist world. And if you use that terminology, I mean, the differences are just so stark, it's almost obscene. So that's very different from what some of the metaphysical claims, and we haven't used the word metaphysics in this discussion here, but Latour thinks that now he's going to be doing metaphysics and that's going to be some kind of contribution, which is a really bizarre position for an anthropologist to take. It's okay if he wants to play philosopher, but it's really a bizarre move. So it seems to me that what many of the English and the Danes are doing is just attempting to play with philosophy as a way to get some sort of additional public attention to anthropology. And it really does not have anything to do with the empirical work that they're doing. And I sort of see myself along what Eric suggested as an empirical pragmatist, out of which you build theory, not the other way around. So the other thing that I would say is that this ontological turn is also a shortcut, a sloppiness, a simplification that moves from theory downwards rather than from the empirical evidence upwards. So if I can lend you any support in your struggle with the ontological term, I'm happy to do so, but the context that I'm coming from is a slightly different one.
So perhaps we could ask Arthur to come in here also.
Well, Joe and Eric and Michael and our new friend who I just met, looking forward to his talk later. There's a real very interesting set of comments. And Joe, I can understand your situation in the UK, and I thought you did a terrific job, but they're pushing you, your colleagues are pushing you to be a little bit more, what should I say, rigid than you need to be, I think. And I think what's happened in the US is that this basically, this two-sided extremism has collapsed. That's what I would say. And you see, you can put these things together. So from my perspective, I mean something entirely different by the ontological term. And I believe I'm participating in that. And I believe it's about being and becoming, and arguing that being and becoming are related to, parallel to, interconnected with, but somewhat different than a meaning-centered approach. I think João Biel's book on becoming is an instance of this. But from the kind of materials you're working with, I would strongly encourage you to read the psychoanalyst Thomas Ogden, O-G-D-E-N, and you can get his work in the summer edition of Perspectives in Biology and Medicine. I have a piece that's called Varieties of Care, and I start with Ogden, and Ogden makes he recognizes that there's an enormous overlap in psychoanalysis, but recognizes that there are the distinct approaches at which Freud and post-Freudians have had a strong emphasis on the centrality of meaning, but that your British psychoanalysts, Fairbairn, Bion, Winnicott, they were, without giving up the idea of the importance of meaning, they also wanted to emphasize the patient's being and becoming. And you know, this led Bion, for example, and Winnicott to this extraordinary insight that when you get beyond William James's stream of consciousness and get to the most innermost part of subjectivity, you get to silence. That's Bion's idea. That's Winnicott's idea. That's Fairbairn's idea, and it's an incredibly interesting idea about being. Emphasize the way that you are, and therefore their treatments have emphasized not so much reconciling meanings, but simply you becoming different. So you move from a state of anxiety to a state where you're more comfortable with yourself and others, and that for them is what effective outcome is, without any resolution in the domain of meaning. And the reason to simply, you know, take that seriously, I think, is it leads to this, you know, before I say what I'm going to say, let me predicate this by saying, if I was surrounded by the kind of anthropologist you are, and by Derek Summerfield, for example, a psychiatrist who buys into that line, I would be exactly where you are, okay? But I'm suggesting you don't have to be where you are. You can put these two things together in what I believe is a very useful way. And indeed, I think my colleague Joe Gone, who spoke recently to us, does that. He comes himself out of a clinical psychology tradition. He has a strong ethical commitment to caregiving, but he also values deeply the spirituality of the American Indian tradition and brings that together. And I think that if I were to suggest the kind of thing we could aim for, in 1998 or 1999, the writer John Philip Santos, a very interesting guy who was a Rhodes Scholar, brilliant critic, wrote a book called Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, about the Chicano experience in America. And it is a fantastic book. that brings meaning and being together about as, and with a central aim to get at what he thinks is the quality in Chicano culture of sadness and of loss, and a sense of working with a past that is disappearing, or that it has to be rebooted up, as it were, rebooted. But I think we can do this, and I think you're doing it. So I would just say, don't allow this opposition to force you into too rigid a role where you have to bend over backward to make the clinical case. The clinical case is made, okay? And you're a good example of its utility. But I think the other questions you were asked by Eric, for example, are really interesting. So one of the most exciting things in China right now is they're putting together traditional Chinese medicine and biomedicine. Now, the way they do it, they undercut the theory of traditional Chinese medicine and sort of bring the practical, empirical sides together. But the practitioners actually themselves try to entertain both. And what's nice about it is that they become much more interested in patients. They're the practitioners who don't get sued in China or attacked, okay? Whereas biomedical practitioners have gotten into tremendous problems in China, largely for the capitalism that Michael talked about and the distrust around them. So I was very intrigued by your presentation. I just don't want you to be forced into too strong a position that you don't need to be in. You can have your position, and you can also engage with a different view of being and becoming. That's not meant to sort of decenter humanity by saying, oh, we're talking about all kinds of beings, and human beings are only a small portion of this. But it's meant to, in humanity, look at what Heidegger, what I think many in the Heideggerian tradition of philosophy wanted us to do, which was to get at some dimension of being that challenges the dominance of language and symbolic forms. But that doesn't say that the language and symbolic forms are non-existent, but merely looks at this. The other part of this I would say is, for example, think of Kant. When Kant said that feelings are beyond reason, he actually said something enormously important that we usually forget. It may not have been Kant's intention, but using Kant, it can be our intention to therefore show the importance of the unconscious, which I think is one of the great failings in anthropology and also in medicine, is to acknowledge the significance of the unconscious. And to say the unconscious is not captured necessarily by our rational structures and requires another kind of interpretation. I think that's what Byron is working on, actually, with the hauntology in some way. So anyway, I really enjoyed the talk. And I can tell you, if I was in your shoes in the UK, I would do exactly the same thing, but I would know that I was making, I was forcing myself too much to react to critics rather than fully develop the argument that you have, which is a powerful one.
Clearly, we have a lot of issues that we could carry on with, and hopefully over this semester and next, we will continue to carry on. Joe, do you want to make just a very quick,
Next week, Byron.
Yes, next week, certainly. Joe, do you want to make a quick comment, not too long, hopefully, and we'll get a few more people into this discussion?
Yeah, sure. I really appreciate the input of both of all of you. And I certainly am aiming for some understanding. Certainly, I try to be provocative with my colleagues and argue the other point because I like a good fight and argument, and I think that can be productive. Or at least for my students, I want to show them there's other lenses besides this popular fancy one. I do think that I seek the flexibility to, when I'm looking at behavioral disorders among the Navajos, to be fully relativist and say this, what they do works better than what I do, which is the conclusion I reached with the book. And in Bhutan, dealing specifically with severe mental disorders and a different set of ritual procedures, I want the flexibility to come to a different conclusion, rather than kind of take the party line and argue always for one side of the, the argument for the prosecution, rather than trying to dialectically balance the two sides of the argument and come to some, convincing sort of argument. So I appreciate. I'll look at all those books you mentioned, Arthur, if I can find them, and also with Michael. Yeah, maybe we should commiserate and then discuss at some point. I do tend to think it's the students, the young people especially, are worried about the environment, and they've been sold an idea that to be environmentally friendly, you have to be an animist. You have to go back to animism, and I don't quite get it, but I think it's a strange packaging of a bunch of dissimilar ideas that just has become very, very much a fashionable virtue signaling within an elite kind of clique that tends to be more and more, to me, disconnected from the realities that people live. So I think it is othering. I agree with you completely there, and exoticizing.
Well, let me call on a couple more people. Mary Jo, I know, would like to make a comment. I don't know, Alistair, if Alistair is still around. One of the issues that was potentially embedded, Joe, in what you said, and it's something that I understand from having worked with treatment of psychosis in Indonesia, you seem to also suggest that there's something radically different between studying psychotic illness and studying something like mild depression, et cetera. And I wonder whether that distinction really holds up. And that's partly why I thought we might also get Alistair commenting about psychosis from a more psychoanalytic point of view. So let's start. Mary Jo, I know you had a comment to make, and then I want to see if Alistair is around still.
Joe, thank you very much. And Uli as well. Wonderful presentations. I want to move out of the sphere of anthropology talk and ask you some questions about the art. Those massive, wonderful paintings, the blue creatures, etc. Who made them, and are they creations from an earlier time, or are they desired now? Are there people who create those? What are they thinking when they're doing them? Are they what kind of meaning do they have? If we think about the ethnographic power of your presentation was both your stories about the clinical, the very nice, I think, bringing together of your clinical ethics and looking at the situation of actually the cultural, the cultural and the clinical coming together. I really like that very much. I think of it as, very much tied into the work of Roberto Luis Fernandez and the psychiatrists who look at the cultural within particularism and universalism with him, like Gladson Hinton. But those are such powerful paintings. And I couldn't capture, I didn't turn on my camera, on my phone to be able to really, focus in on the blue creature with the skulls and the deer and so on. Can you say something more about that, those images that you were putting up there for us to look at?
Several of them were on the walls, murals on the walls of monasteries or dzongs. A couple, I think, were from Punica Dzong. The dzong, the really nice one I showed first, this fortress. And they also make tankas, scroll paintings with these divinities who are always with their consort having sex, because it's coming together of compassion and wisdom. And there's, you know, the tantric school of thought there. But they still make these tankas. People buy them to meditate on, to identify with the divinity. And also I can mention wonderful ritual music. That was one of the things first that got me interested in Bhutan, was an album of the Tibetan monastic choir and their chants, and just amazing. Sometimes I'll have to share that with you and Byron, and you can hear the music as well. A fascinating artistic tradition, certainly.
So does that play a role in the psychological being and treatments if people are concerned? Do they look into these? I mean, it seems to me there's a whole story there about struggle, the you know, the psychological struggles and being in power and emotionality in those things. So I'm just wondering, you know, how do people talk about them? And if you can't get a job in a bank, would you go in and make a painting? Who does?
Yeah, I should mention that there's a school for traditional arts in the capital city where they train new generations on how to make these paintings as well as other artistic pieces. And so that is still a very living tradition. And in terms of how it intersects with psychology, this is the vast apparatus of culture that I see as part of the therapeutic. And it certainly is, you know, it orients people's psychology, maybe prevents certain problems. It might also create problems, though. I had several monks who, you know, they go and isolate themselves for years to meditate. And then I saw them after they went psychotic. So it's kind of a double-edged sword with the traditions and supporting mental health, but also sometimes endangering it. But certainly the whole culture, as Joe Gaughan was saying a few weeks ago, is also therapy in some sense.
Alistair, are you still with us? Would you like to make a comment here?
I think, did he go off?
I see his name still there, but maybe he is not. I think if Alistair's, if you're there, turn your sound on. Otherwise, we'll move. I think we should move to conclusion. It's 12 o'clock. Joe, terrific presentation. Uli, thank you so much for joining in. For those of you who have commented, I think it was a very engaged conversation. I thought, Joe, in certain ways, the very ending where you talked about the psychological functioning of the psychological power of these kinds of ritual forms, etc., was a step beyond where this kind of initial reaction that against a certain kind of rigid Orientalist ontological set of claims. And you, of course, know that you and I share Hallowell as a founding figure in much of this work, as we learned together from Ray Fogelson and others. So, and from those years at Chicago. So I want to thank everyone and welcome. You'll join us again. We have a group of us who have been participating in a discussion now that goes back a number of years about haunting and hauntology. We'll take that on next week. That will include Sadek and Andrea and Mary Jo and Reza Idria, who I hope will be able to join us from Aceh and take on those issues that were raised in the recent Ethos volume that Sadek and I edited, and look forward to the discussion next week. So thank you all for joining and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone, and really enjoyed it.
It was really terrific,
Thank
Joe.
you.
Glad to see.
Wonderful to see everyone again.
Nice to
Thank
see
you, Joe. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
Relative, anti-relevist, relevist, anti-relevist, relativist. You got to write that down, Joe. I mean, the wordplay is just
I was trying
Incredible.
to do all of it, and then finally, my pen ran out of ink.
You got a
The
patent
short
that, I mean,
version,
really.
the short version for my students is if you say everything's relative, then so's that. That's the
Michael,
short one.
Hey, Tracy, tell us what your experience has been like. Have you gone along with Joe on much of this?
I was in Bhutan for,
I'm sorry.
was it Joe?
This is still being
Two,
recorded.
two,
Do you want me to
Stop
stop?
the
or
recording.
should I
Yeah,
continue?
stop the recording.
Yeah, okay.
thanks. Yeah, I was in Bhutan for 2 summers with